all victims of oppression, for the tyrants fear your might. Don't cling so hard to your possessions, for you have nothing if you have no rights. Let racist ignorance be ended, for respect makes the empires fall. Freedom is merely privilege extended, unless enjoyed by one and all. So come brothers and sisters, for the struggle carries on. The International unites the world in song. So comrades, come rally, for this is the time and place. The international ideal unites the human race. Let no one build walls to divide us, walls of hatred nor walls of stone. Come greet the dawn and stand beside us. Live together or we'll die alone. In our world poisoned by exploitation, those who will take on, they must give. And then the vanity of nations will look one earth on which to live. So the fathers, sisters, for the struggle carries on. The International unites the world in song. So comrades, rally, for this is the time and place. The international ideal unites the human race. And so begins the final drama in the streets and in the fields. We stand unbound before their armor, we defy their guns and shields. When we fight, provoked by their aggression, let us be inspired by life and love. Although they offer us concessions, change will not come from above. So the for the struggle carries on. The International unites the world in song. So comrades, for this is the time and place. The International unites the
Greetings, everyone. I hope you enjoyed that Billy Bragg version of the Internationale in English. Welcome today. This is, we got a thumbs down from Dr. Riggins. Welcome all today. This is our first of the Midwestern Marx Cadre Formation School, where the goal is to discuss traditional texts in the Marxist tradition amongst comrades, explain the text, and really refine what's being said in it. And with the hope of educating our audience and ourselves, because when you teach, you're also always a student. We're here with myself, Carlos Garrido, with Eddie Liger-Smith, of course, with Comrade Calla Winchell, and with our senior editorial counselor for Midwestern Marx and the author of Reading the Classical Texts of Marxism, which you can see up there, Dr. Thomas Riggins. So thank you all for joining us today. The text we're going to be discussing is a text that Marx publishes in 1859. It's called A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, which is a title that plays on an essay that Engels submitted to the journal that Marx was working for as an editor in the early 40s. But this work functions as a sort of dress rehearsal for Capital. Capital would be published in 1867, just a few years afterward. And in this text, he touches on some of the same themes that appear in the first three sections of Capital. However, what's the most memorable about this text is the preface, where Marx sits down and reflects on what has been done basically over the last 20 years of studies. And he does so in 2 to 3 pages. So it's been a text that over the last century people have been recommending as the sort of archetype for getting to understand the Marxist method and getting to understand historical materialism. Out of this text, famous metaphors such as the base and superstructure spatial metaphor arise. You also have famous quotes about how social relations determine consciousness. You have the theme of the contradiction that develops between the relations and the forces of production, how the forces of production become fetters for the development of how the relations of productions, become fetters for the forces of production and hinder progress, and how when ideas for liberation arise in the consciousness of a people, it means that the conditions have already been created for that liberation to occur. If you will, we're going to turn to Comrade Kala to discuss some of your initial thoughts on the text, and then we're going to turn to Comrade Eddie and then to Comrade Tom to discuss their initial thoughts, and then we'll refine a little bit more and look at the text directly afterwards.
Yeah, it's a really interesting piece. In some ways, it's sort of an exercise in him establishing his authority to talk about the subject. And so it's sort of an interesting combination of a history of a personal ideal and a personal history too. There's some sort of accounting of him, the various places he's chased out of in Europe. And so it's an interesting mix of a preview of Capital and a personal history sort of establishing his right and authority to talk about it. And there's some Hegel shout outs too. So you can't go wrong.
Yeah, I like what he said about Hegel, actually, the way he said that he finished his, critical appraisal of all of Hegel's legal work. Because I was in some debates recently with some anarchists who were basically making this simplistic argument that Marx simply reversed everything Hegel said, because that taking that quote that Marx turns Hegel on his head, and just using that to try and give a simplistic idea of Hegel's philosophy. But really, Marx makes a systematic analysis of Hegel, and Hegel brings Marx pretty close to a lot of his conclusions, and brings Marx to the conclusion that he needs to study political economy, which is what he's writing about in this. And he's kind of basically explaining how he comes to the conclusion that political economy is the basis of civil society. And then in Capital, he then goes on and gives that actual analysis of political economy. So yeah, I think it kind of lays the basis or it's sort of like Marx explaining why he did the in-depth analyses that he did later on. So yeah, I think it's really, really useful and a really good summary of what we call dialectical materialism. That's all I got.
Dr. Riggins, any initial thoughts on the text?
Well, you guys have pretty well covered the significance of that text. The important thing, though, is that one long paragraph, actually it's part of a longer paragraph, is excerpted out, is really a great summation of the entire Marxist system in one long paragraph. And if you're teaching Marxism, I would think that after you teach the Communist Manifesto to people, that if you just spent a week on that sentence by sentence on that paragraph, your scholars would understand Marxism, and could go right on then into more complicated readings from Hegel and from Engels and from Marx.
I absolutely agree. I've been using it for the last year and a half that I've been teaching intro, and it's really good at dispelling a lot of the myths that people have because of the rampant anti-communism of the McCarthyite era and the form that the idea of communism has taken in popular consciousness in the U.S. Just with a matter of, like you mentioned, a long paragraph, you can dispel so many myths about what socialism is, what Marxism is, and specifically, there's this idea that reigns that socialism is just socialized poverty, and of course we know the empire intentionally tries to keep socialist countries in poverty through sanctions, through blockades, through different forms of warfare, and then it points and it says it's just trying to make everyone economically equal and poor, and you have an argument here which is quite potent. That's that part of the reason why capitalism is going to fail is because the relations on which it is based prevent the progress of humanity. It prevents the progress, the development of the productive forces. And I don't know if we can see that any clearer than today when, there's so many areas for the expansion of production, for the development of science and technology, and it's all really stifled and limited by the profit motive, because what ultimately ends up being developed is what ends up being profitable, not what ends up being useful for human life.
Absolutely. Did anyone have anything going off of that? If not, I have kind of a separate point I wanted to make. Oh no, we lost Kala. Okay, I'll just go ahead and say what I was going to say. But
I think a Wi-Fi.
I think too, in showing the basics, like, we've been in this debate a lot about reading and encouraging people to read, and there's a lot of people online who question the importance of reading theory. I don't know, those people might be directly from the CIA. I'm not entirely sure, but either way, this is just 2 short pages, and it's very simple. And like you said, it dispels so many myths, and I think it would be useful for a lot of the sort of rad libs who maybe have Marxist in their Twitter bio, but kind of treat Marxism just like it's a radical form of liberalism. And you see here, Marxism is the study of political economy as the basis of civil society. And Marx says here that changes in the material basis of production always need to be analyzed separately from changes in the superstructure or the ideological expression of the class struggle. And then you have, sort of these rad lib Marxists today who are focusing all of their effort on social issues and I guess what you call superstructural battles, but I guess not even, just like basically distractions for the most part. Not that every debate around social issues is a complete distraction, but what Marxism is a focus on the material basis of society, how the means of subsistence are produced and distributed. And there's so little talk of that on the Marxist left today. Most of our debates have nothing to do with that. And I think it's that's a nice mug. I think it's a sign of our lack of theoretical development, our infantile disorder on the left.
Got 3 blind mice on
it. Yeah, I think that there's that charge that, the most online Twitterist take in the world is that reading is elitist or, something to that level. But there are these works of Marxism that do not require 900 pages of reading, although you should do that reading too. But there's this reading that's much more accessible that contains these ideas that are so essential to understand. This is the most concise summation of historical materialism that I can find, and it's literally what 2.5 pages or something like that. So yeah, I think that this sort of, it's not like you have to read all of these dense books in order to get these important ideas. That is, like you said, a CIA talking point.
Tom, did you ever think that people will be saying that telling other people that they should read would be elitist? Did you ever think that that would be something that the communist movement would be dealing with?
Telling other people they should read?
Well, no, there's a group of people, there's a tendency online of self-proclaimed, it's so ridiculous that it's even hard to fathom, but there's a tendency online of self-proclaimed communists who tell other communists that when they promote reading to their audience, that is itself elitist. Did you think that something like that would ever end up developing within
It's unfair and mean to people who don't know how to read. So we shouldn't promote theory. That's what they say.
And we shouldn't promote YouTube and videos for the people who are blind.
Right.
Discrimination.
Right.
You have to know what they mean, though, because the whole I don't know if this is. I think this is a statement that Marxists use. It's not from the classics, but it's from the literacy campaigns that were done in Cuba and in China and in other areas where Marxists come over, where people go out and teach illiterate people how to read, and they're taught by people who maybe themselves have only just learned a little bit of reading in literacy courses. And it's a slogan that all teachers know of: each one teach one.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not elitist at all. It can be elitist if you go out there and say, well, we're going to have to do this in Latin because this is the language that's used by all different types of intellectuals around the world, or used to be. Or we have to do it in the original language. If you don't know German, keep your mouth shut. That can be elitist, but I don't know what a self-proclaimed. There are so many self-proclaimed groups out there. If we're Marxist-Leninists and we are pushing Marxism-Leninism, Lenin didn't believe that you could be a communist if you were isolated. You could only be a communist if you were part of a collective that was working together in a political party with principles based on Marxism to educate the working class and bring the knowledge of Marxist ideas, to which admittedly were developed by bourgeois intellectuals, philosophers, to bring them to the working class. Originally, Lenin said the working class, you all know that, but for our audience, I had to be elitist there. Talk. The
suit elitist authority.
Yes, well, you told me you're going to wear a blazer and we should dress up because we wanted to look like.
I was trying to set you up.
Like Wolf. He's always dressed nicely. We should look like him.
Guayabera is a good midpoint, though. That's like formal wear in Cuba.
Yes. Anyway, back at the ranch, there was the idea originally that working people on their own will not become more than trade union consciousness. They won't question this. They won't get around to thinking and question the system, but they will know they're getting screwed and will know they're being exploited. They'll want a bigger part of the pie. They won't know that they are the actual bakers of all the pies that everybody else is eating. But after that initial wokenness can take place in the working class, then the working class should be able to produce its own intellectuals. That doesn't mean they still can't have allies from the bourgeoisie.
Right. And that's something that's kind of predicted in the manifesto of the Communist Party, in that section where he talks about a section of the intellectuals and of the bourgeoisie breaking off and joining the proletariat, because they have the foresight to see where history is heading. And, as we've talked about in the last few lives, I've been engaging in a project that's focused on Gramsci and on the theory of the intellectual and their roles in revolution. And it's such an important thing to explore, because precisely, although today we have the means where we have a working class that is literate, and there's different conditions from, the 1902 pamphlet What Is to Be Done, out of which some of these ideas arise, it is still the case that people uh, need to be educated. Working class people are spending most of their time working, and if a segment of the most advanced part of the working class can help facilitate the theoretical advancement of the whole working class, that has to be done. I really don't see how a revolutionary movement can take place if that's not the case, if that's not done. That sort of fetish for spontaneity, for people to just develop on their own right ideas, it's doomed to failure. And we see it infiltrated today, I think, through this movement of people that are pushing folks away from reading.
I mean, teaching people to read has been one of the things that MLs have done forever in every successful ML movement. That was one of the things that brought me to socialism, was studying Venezuela and learning about their misiones and their anti-poverty programs and their literacy programs. They literally abolished illiteracy in their country. UNESCO went there, and they were like, in like a matter of 10 years, they taught everybody to read. And somebody brings up this about Michael Parenti's father, which is a story he tells where he wrote a book for his dad, and made an acknowledgement to his father in the book and thanked him. And he gave it to his dad, and his dad started crying because he wasn't able to read it. He didn't have the training. He wasn't ever taught to read at that level, and he couldn't understand it. And then Parenti talks about the anti-poverty programs, or the literacy campaigns in Cuba, and what it actually means to teach people to read, how liberating it is to give somebody the ability, the skill of reading, and how much knowledge and how much intellectual development that opens a person up to. So it's, the opposite of what we should be arguing for as MLs. Reading is constructive. Reading leads to liberation, and reading leads to intellectual and theoretical development in a more revolutionary and organized working class movement.
Yeah.
Right. And like you mentioned, Tom, every single revolution that has occurred, one of the main things they prioritize is literacy campaigns, and they teach people to be literate through also teaching them theory. During the Cuban Revolution, one of the things that Che always prioritized was reading, and he was teaching people how to read, amongst other things, within actively doing guerrilla warfare. That might be a little extreme, but it shows to the extent that these revolutionary leaders that we look up to, the extent that they prioritize reading and learning. And China was the same thing. One of the first things before the formation of the Communist Party, when they're still participating in the new culture movement, but flirting with the ideas of Marxism, one of the first things that connects that group that eventually becomes the leadership, the cadre for the founding of the party, to the masses and to the workers and the peasants in China, are schools that they end up doing, public schools that they do out of Peking University for the peasants and the workers. And they were all free, of course. And so, but to turn to the text, I want to pull up real quick the text, and I think it will be helpful for us to read a sentence or two and then marinate over it, think about it a little bit, and see what's being said here. Let's see. Do you all see my screen? So I think this is where the meaty stuff starts. The Marxist Internet Archive broke it up, but it's really it's one long paragraph in the book. But he says that after talking about switching his focus to political economy, which again, it's something that Marx did in part because of Engels and their famous meeting in 1843 or 1844. After meeting Engels, Engels tells him, look, you're brilliant, but you have to study political economy, which Marx really hadn't studied much at that time. So he spends the next almost 2 decades studying political economy. And he says, well, these are the summary of what the summary of my studies. He's going to say that Okay, let me highlight the text for the people at home. In the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations which are independent of their will, namely relations of production appropriate to a given stage in the development of their material forces of production. The totality of these relations of productions constitute the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure, and to which these correspond definite forms of social consciousness. So we can analyze that there. What do you guys think?
That was actually one that I had written down to talk about. Interestingly enough, it's sort of a basic Marxist concept. It reminds me of Lenin's quote, like, you can't exist within a society and not participate in that society, or like, so I can't remember exactly what it is, but basically you can't be fully independent of the society you're in. And Marx is saying that, you know, your position in society is based on definite relations, based on your relation to the means of production. So yeah, I think that's a basic point to understand. And it's one that makes sense if you think about in any mode of production, you know, your sort of status and how much how you're able to reproduce your means of subsistence is based on your relationship to the means of production, which usually then determines, you know, what you do all day, what your actual labor process is, where you spend most of your time in your life.
A phrase that sticks out to me as well is that it's a teeny little phrase, which are independent of their will, right? In the context of, in the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations which are independent of their will. This is such a good example of what we were talking about, how this piece functions as a distillation of so much Marxist thought in so little space. The coercive elements of capital are so clear, and at least for me, when I was first reading Capital, Volume 1, that element of lack of free will, which for a lot of capitalists and capitalist believers is central to the functioning of capital, that everyone has choice. And of course, that's an empty promise. The choice is die or work, which is no good choice at all. But it's just that whole philosophy is distilled in that single sentence, independent of their will, in a really beautiful way that really just highlights the coercive elements that are sort of structural to capital. It's really elegant.
Good. Tom, do you have any thoughts?
That's pretty clear. I don't think I'm going to have any original thoughts here about Marx's statements in that paragraph. They're pretty clear, especially what Carla brings out about the your will. You know, people don't. It has to do with certain types of work that people have to do that might be degrading, and work that people would really look down upon. It's a society forces people, as you say, to eat or die. And it may be in certain types of work that we can eliminate entirely as professions when we have socialism.
That line about subordinating your will to labor, to the labor process that you're forced into to reproduce your means of subsistence, that always reminds me of the summer I worked at a non-union concrete job that was like 60 hours a week, just ridiculous. Mostly immigrant labor, just people who were in a tough situation where they couldn't work anywhere else. It was like you basically just had to subordinate your will to being there all day and not getting any enjoyment out of life. And pretty much all of them were alcoholics. You know, and you talk about eliminating a job like that completely with technology eventually, or, you know, massively decreasing the amount that those people have to work. That would be great. It would give them so much more life. But right now, you know, they've just completely subordinated themselves to, this is what I do to survive.
Absolutely. I think one of the the most important things that appears in this text, in as concrete a form as it's ever appeared in the history of Western philosophy, is the notion that we don't just think outside in a void somewhere. Our thinking is always grounded in specific context, and that's something that Hegel already knew. That's something that Rousseau already knew. If you read Rousseau's discourse on inequality, one of the things that he criticizes from the other social contract theorists is that they're all just projecting the existing relations that they live under and the existing ideas and the existing biases and sort of character that people have. They're just projecting that back onto history. And he's saying that's a big mistake. Now Rousseau does a similar projection. Hegel likewise. Hegel's very clear that all thinking is grounded in its historical moment, in specific definite relations that exist in the state, in civil society. The problem with Hegel is that he also doesn't really go far enough and see, what are the material grounds that themselves work as the ground, the Grund in German, for the institutions where these ideas exist. But Hegel's also very clear that philosophy can only ever be its time reflected in thoughts. But in Marx, this same spirit of thinking that's always concrete, thinking that's always embodied and embedded in specific societies and specific modes of production, specific relations, and the subsequent different superstructural fields that arise from those, that's very profound. And that it's somewhat commonsensical to us now. But at its time, that's such a radical shift to say, look, our thinking is always going to be bound by our context. We can never escape and make these abstract universal statements. One of the most beautiful statements that Hegel makes is that if there is an abstract universal, it's false. It's empty. It's nothing. All universals come from the concrete. All forms of true thinking are rooted in the concrete. And I think that we get that here in this text in a more concise and refined form than has ever appeared in the history of Western thought.
Eddie, somebody's spying in through your door.
Yes.
Who's that?
What?
Who's spying on you through your door being open?
That's the CIA.
Probably one of my roommates.
There's a guy peeking in at you. Look at your door. Your door's open. On the other side.
My roommates are really nosy. Like, they don't know how to leave me alone.
As long as you don't see a glove go in with like a weapon of some sort, I think you'll be okay.
You just keep your door shut.
Just don't get arrested on stream like Gavin McInnes, and you should be fine, right?
That's hilarious.
Oh.
As to what you were saying, I know that reminded me of Parenti quote in his Assassination of Julius Caesar, given a People's History of Rome. He basically just says that historians covering Caesar basically take what Cicero and other wealthy aristocratic historians had written about Caesar, who was, hated by them because he was a populari. He was advocating for various, land redistribution policies and anti-debt policies. And so the aristocrats like Cicero hated him, but, the ruling class of society always writes as if their own interests are the interests of all society. And then even, since Roman times, those ruling class histories get passed down and repeated until they become long-standing myths. So we always have to understand that any production of a historical work or philosophical work or whatever it is, we need to look at the historical context that it was produced in and probably the class position of the person producing it, or at least their ideological leanings.
Yeah, it's a fancy trick that really, I guess, all material conditions will replicate, but especially capital, of naturalizing itself. So that the way that it things are now is the way they always have been, eternally so, and we frame and encounter all new information from that perspective. And so questioning that and denaturalizing what is now is really the project of Marxist-Leninists, sort of peeking through the superstructure and the way it blinds you to, the economic reality underneath that undergirds truth.
Right. Because if you, I think this is a switch that you really get with in the transition from like Locke to Rousseau. I don't know why I keep going to the moderns, but with Locke, as soon as you labor, the fruit of that is private property. With Rousseau, the conception arises that only under definite relations does the fruit of labor become private property. And, that's commonsensical for us Marxists, but that's so emancipatory because, if you feel like you're oppressed by a social order, if you feel exploited, if you feel alienated, but if you think that that order is natural and that things have always been that way, how are you going to fight it? It's like fighting a god. You can even add a theological dimension to it, and they did, right? This is how God wanted things. It's so incredibly hard to fight against something that you think has always existed, because you're literally basically at the vanguard, not just of a specific social order, but at the vanguard of humanity, right? So what's the point of fighting if it's always been like this and it's always going to be like this? But once you're able to, as you put it nicely, peek through the veil of the superstructure, once you're able to do that, you're able to show that this arose under specific conditions that were shaped by active human beings. They weren't just shaped by the gods, they were shaped by human beings. And just like these relations arose in a specific historical moment, they can be removed in a specific historical moment. And that right there creates the potential for emancipation like nothing else, denaturalizing the experience that people have and telling them there could be an alternative if you work for it, because there have been alternatives in the past. That's so important.
Oh, you go ahead, Gala. Sorry.
Well, I was just there's the famous Ursula K. Le Guin quote, so too did the divine right of kings seem natural, and was completely unquestionable. And yet obviously we discarded monarchs, which is very topical. And just like we have, moved on from the divine right of kings, we can move on from the divine right of capital.
Absolutely. Yeah, we've had so many people just dunking on the queen in our comments.
And we love it. Keep it coming. I'm enjoying it.
It does. It is funny. We're just talking about Carlos is going in depth about dialectical materialism. People are just like, rest in peace, bozo. It's a good contrast. But I thought this was an interesting comment where Carlos and I were actually talking about the DPRK today, and I was doing some TikTok videos on it. But the most philosophical thought has been in the atmosphere of the elite and ruling classes. Juche is one of the few that was written in the atmosphere of the socialist working ruling class. And yeah, that goes back to what we were saying about the working class eventually producing their own academics. So you see in countries like China and the DPRK, they're making all these advancements in Marxist philosophy, and applying, like China's applying contradiction analysis to every aspect of society. And you're seeing all these advancements that are made in Marxist philosophy because the working class is now, the ruling class in those countries, and they are producing their own academics in a different context. And, I think it's better work just overall, yeah.
It reminds me of a famous quote from the end of Engels' short pamphlet on Ludwig Feuerbach and the outcome of classical German philosophy, where he says something along the lines of the German working class being the inheritor of the tradition of German philosophy. And it gets to a point, and this is something that Marx realized, that once you have that bias of the existing order, it prevents you from doing successful science, or at least social science. And we get this with I believe the first ever preface to Capital, to the German edition of Capital, he says it. It got to a point when the bourgeois class was no longer revolutionary, and the bourgeois political economists that arose from that class were getting farther and farther away from the truth. To some extent, if you want to really engage with truth in your theorizing and your science, you have to have a proletarian outlook. And so Engels had this faith that the working class was going to inherit this tradition of philosophy, this tradition of system building, of scientific thinking, because, as has been said nicely, eloquently by Che, reality is Marxist. And if you want to grapple with truth, as the enterprise of philosophy has tried to do for the last 2,500 years, you're going to have to be a revolutionary if you really want to grapple with truth. So I think that's very interesting, and it gets back to the point that that Tom was making earlier, which is that first, because of illiteracy, you might need the faction that breaks off from the traditional intellectuals to educate the working class. But then the working class is going to be able to develop intellectuals of their own, right? Because in the process of class struggle, they lower the working day, they gain reforms for education, and they create conditions for socialist and Marxist intellectuals to rise from the ranks of the working class itself and not have to wait for them to be educated by the professional intellectuals of the existing order, which, as Marx and Engels already knew, they were bound to, in some form or another, bring biases from their class position into the working class. And, that's something that he noticed with Ferdinand Lassalle, and other people in the socialist movement in Germany. And that's something that he fought against quite a bit.
And it's not even just biases of people in different fields, but like I'm studying healthcare administration right now. It's like there is nowhere for the field to go because of capitalism. Everyone realizes every sector of the healthcare system is commodified, at least in the US. It's completely fragmented, mostly because of the insurance companies. You have separate private ambulance companies who won't work with certain hospitals or certain clinics. So when you have sick people or people with deathly injuries who need to get taken to a hospital, the ambulance won't take them there because they have to go to a hospital that's within their system. And, as it's getting more and more expensive and 60% of Americans experience medical debt at some point, these medical corporations are making more and more and more money. So what is then the academic field of healthcare administration? You just throw up your hands and say, well, so long as we have capitalism, there's almost nothing we can do about this. And it also reminds me of something from the passage that we read today about how one mode of production fully develops before you see the transformation into the next mode of production. And I could see that in healthcare so clearly. Like the US has the most advanced technological capacity in our healthcare system in the world. It's just that it's completely commodified, and it's not used to actually bring people healthcare. It's used to make money. But if we centralize the healthcare system, if it was public instead of this fragmented system, the technology has developed to the point where we could have this massive nationally interconnected system where you have specialists in every area who can communicate via telehealth and distribute healthcare to everybody pretty easily. But we're not doing that because there's too many stakeholders who are making too much money off the system. So the only thing to do about it is to struggle against them and eventually nationalize those companies. But you're not allowed to suggest that in healthcare administration. You just have to kind of beat around the bush and think, oh, the system's real bad. Hopefully it gets better. We just need to trust in our leaders and stakeholders like big pharma. So yeah, it also influences every field in that way to where certain fields of study have become entirely commodified.
Right, and I think it's interesting how it doesn't just shape the thoughts of people that are clearly aligned with the existing order, that function within the existing institutions in a way that they feel at home there, but it also infiltrates the thought of radicals, right? Quote unquote radicals, the people that think there's something wrong and that want to think about alternatives or want to think about critiques. And I think a good example of the sort of naturalizing effect that the existing ideology produces and how we understand the world is the Lincoln quote, the pro-labor Lincoln quote. And I have it somewhere here. Labor is superior to capital and deserves much the higher consideration. And he says after that, that capital is only the fruit of labor. Without labor, capital doesn't exist. But that is itself a mistake. That is a theoretical mistake that sees capital as something that naturally results from labor. And that's not the case. Only under definite social conditions does capital, as capital, develop, becomes the product of labor. So there you have an example of someone who is theorizing from a somewhat critical position, but that is at their core they're still holding on to the essence of the existing outlook. I think another one is Proudhon. Proudhon was one of the major figures in the anarchist and socialist and syndicalist movement in Europe, extremely influential ideologically, but Proudhon internalized a lot of the biases of the existing order and of the theory of the political economists at the time. If you read the manuscripts that Marx was working through at the same time as he was writing this, we now know them as the Grundrisse, but the economic manuscripts from 1857 to around 1861, one of the main people that Marx is criticizing is Proudhon, and his idea that you can just create these labor notes that you can then exchange, right? But because it's all tied to a society that's mediated through exchange and exchange value. And the idea that Marx brings forth as, what communism actually is when you cut that mediation and production becomes direct appropriation by the community. Social production becomes direct social appropriation, and you eliminate that mediation. But you have here with Proudhon, and you had it in the US with a lot of the socialists that existed here, the idea that socialism is when the laborer gets to pay directly with the hours that they labored. And it sounds nice, right? Especially when you're just getting into socialism. That sounds like what makes sense. But that is itself, it's prolonging and proliferating the ideas that ground an order that's mediated through commodity production and through exchange value.
That's true.
So, why do you think Fourier thought that water was going to turn into lemonade?
I'm much more interested in Berkeley's experiments with tar water. He thought tar. Is it tar water, Tom, or was it a different type of water?
It's tar water, and I want to know why Hegel's logic is God's thought before the creation of any finite being.
Bishop Berkeley thought that tar water was his panacea. If you drink tar water, it'll function how Pepto-Bismol does today, that it doesn't matter what you have. If you have a broken arm, a stomach, a headache, if you drink Pepto-Bismol, you're good to go. Or as duct tape does for athletes, it doesn't, if you break your arm in half, just put some tape on it and you're good to go, get back on the field.
Was there
But,
actually... Oh,
yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
No, go.
It's a very important question. I was going to say, was there actually cocaine in the original Coca-Cola? Like, that makes sense that doctors would distribute it. You give someone, like, cocaine, and they're like, I feel fucking awesome. Like, it works.
It didn't have all those laws in the 19th. Laudanum was full of dope. And I think Coca-Cola's original, that secret, there's this reason that was a secret formula. And people like, if you lived through the horrors of New Coke back in the 70s when they brought out New Coke to replace the old Coke, and there was their market completely, it was like the Edsel of soda pop. You don't see New Coke around anymore. They went back to their old formula. But I don't know there's no Coke in modern Coca-Cola because chemists can analyze it and see what's in there.
No
I
fun.
thought New Coke only lasted for like a week.
Well, they tried to make it last for more than a week. It was around for a while.
That's
And
capitalist innovation right there.
He went the way of Tab.
was it New Coke or Old Coke that killed all those union organizers?
I think that was.
Oh, you mean the ones in South America?
Yeah.
That's the regular Coke that you get.
Regular Coke. Oh, maybe that's why they switched.
Now the Coca-Cola company claims that those are franchises.
Oh, franchise death squads. Love
those
that.
guys down there, they bought the rights to make their own syrup and stuff and use the name Coca-Cola.
My dad stocked shelves for Coke. I broke down their profits versus their wages for him the other day, and he didn't talk for about an hour. He was just thinking about how much fucking money that company makes off every single can of Coke that he puts on a shelf in a day.
32 grams of sugar every can.
Something like that.
The
As long as there's rum, Carlos knows. As long as there's rum, there'll be Coca-Cola.
yes.
That's true. It's the only time I drink Coke.
Well, cocaine was just regularly prescribed at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th. You know, Freud was a cokehead for quite a while, and he was prescribing it to most of his patients.
Sherlock Holmes had the problem with
Sherlock Holmes too. I didn't know that.
And now in the 21st century, we got Adderall.
Yeah.
Now you can give Coke to kids.
Right.
Chemically almost identical to meth. Don't you love it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, things used to be a lot more fun. I mean, drugs were a lot more available until we realized that commies and hippies did drugs and we could lock them up for it.
Well, you got pot. Come on, pot's made a big comeback.
Oh, that's true. Well, they realized they could tax people and make a lot of money off of it. So there you go.
Yeah, the cigarette companies like, he can smoke this too. He can sell this.
Well, I think that works kind of as a good segue to the passage that relates to the fetters of production. Let me see if I pull that up real quick.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
This is, as I mentioned at the beginning of the stream, one of the most surprising things for people that are new to Marxism. He says, the mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. We've been talking about that. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. That's a beautiful line, classic quote. At a certain stage of development, the material forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, or this merely expresses the same thing in legal terms, with the property relations within the framework of which they were operated hitherto, so up to now. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. That's a sort of a way of saying it that they had already been saying it like that since the what we now call the German ideology, the articles that became eventually in the 20th century the book The German Ideology. They were talking about fetters there. Then begins an era of social revolution. The changes in the economic foundation lead sooner or later to the transformation of the whole immense superstructure. So I don't know if we want to analyze that. I think it's very weighty because there's so many fields in which the profit motive is just stifling growth.
I mean, it's exactly what I described with the healthcare system. You know, we have the technology to have this really cohesive, nationalized, centralized, but also decentralized system that treats a lot of people and makes sure to, you know, treat rural areas that struggle for access to healthcare, where 100 hospitals have left within the past, you know, less than the past decade, just because it's not profitable for them. And you see how insurance companies and all these private companies keep the system fragmented and keep it from being this cohesive thing that it could potentially be. And I mean, that's such a perfect example of capitalism being a fetter on production. And the productive forces have developed to the point, the healthcare technology and communication technology has developed, you know, so far beyond this broken mode of production, which is holding the system back. And making it a system that puts people in debt rather than brings people healthcare. So yeah, it's time to bust through that system.
Yeah, and how do you do that?
Sublate it. Nationalize all the healthcare companies after establishing a dictatorship of the proletariat and all the nurses and doctors.
Easier said than done.
You can say that.
We'll do it this weekend. It'll be great. Everything
I
figured
have
out by
some free
Monday.
time.
Right. There's this question that floats around in the internet, but I think it's a genuine theoretical question, which is, what sort of relationship should socialists have to growth and economic growth, especially in light of climate change and the destruction of the empire that capitalist imperialism has brought about. And there's some areas that bring up a term which is degrowth, and that they want to emphasize limiting the productive forces. But very clearly, we have here the notion in Marxism that part of why capitalism is creating its own conditions for being overcome is because there's this central contradiction between the relations of production and the forces of production. The relations present a fetter, a limitation to the progress of the forces of production. So it's very clear that there's a notion that we can grow and grow more efficiently our productive forces under a different set of relations. Now, does that mean that socialism is just going to promote, endless growth of factories and things that are pollutant? No, I think there's a way to have sustainable growth, and I think the essence of eco-socialism is that it's sustainable growth, and it's creating, as Marx alluded to in the third volume of Capital, a rational metabolism between human society and nature. However, this question of growth is interesting because I think that at its core, whether the people that are in favor of just endless growth or the people that are in favor of degrowth, they're both working from within the same outlook. And the outlook is growth centered on things. And I think part of what's the transformation that is occurring here with Marxism is that growth needs to be rethought from a human-centered point of view, which means that in certain areas, you do need more growth. We have an infrastructure that's a D- in the US. You have places around the world that don't have food, that don't have viable structures in order to live in, viable housing. Those places need growth. And those places need growth precisely because those sorts of growth create the conditions for human flourishing, for a human-centered conception of growth that is non-antagonistic to the environment. However, when I'm down in South Florida, I'm existing in a place where there's a lot of homelessness. And around those same homeless people, there's 20 times as many buildings that are empty as there are homeless people. And so to promote growth and more housing in an area where there's already a surplus of housing, that's ridiculous, right? So you can't think of growth quantitatively in terms of let's just have more shit, let's just have more things. You have to think of growth qualitatively, and I think that's part of the shift in thinking of growth away from capital, away from things-centered growth, and towards a human-centered conception of growth that realizes that, there's this analogy that Aristotle used to make. You can have as many pans as you want. You're not going to be a better cook. You do need a certain amount of pans in order to cook good and to develop your skills as a cook. But if you have 200 pans, that's not going to make you any better of a cook. It's not going to make you any better of a human being. So we have to realize that this question of growth is not as simple as is being phrased by some people that are promoting degrowth or some people that are promoting just endless growth. It has to be a human-centered conception of growth, which means giving people the things that they need in order to flourish as human beings in a way that is compatible with both their community and the environment.
Yes, but that can't be done under capitalism. So that
Precisely.
The pans, by the way, it's a great quote from Aristotle. His cook was a slave. So,
there you go, Tom.
He got whatever pots and pans Aristotle was able to provide for him.
He was a close observer, though.
Yes. And as for your friends in South Florida, no capitalists are wanting to build units where there are no people to can pay the rent to live in them. what they did is they miscalculated their market, and this is a leftover from the 2008 collapse of the economy. I saw this, and if you've been in South America, you've seen it too. There are all these look like skyscrapers with these big cranes that have just been frozen there for years, and they haven't continued to. So capitalists don't grow just for growth. They grow when there's a market to make money and make profit. And as for the human, no one is going to feed the people in Ethiopia who are going to starve to death unless they can get a buck out of it. Right. It's just not going to happen. That farmland was turned over to tobacco and hemp and commercial products, and now it's gone. It's not in cultivation, and now the climate has destroyed the rainfalls, and those people are just stuck. If the UN can't convince the United States and the rich companies to use surplus value created by American workers, tax money, in other words, to give that to food for these people, and that money has already been earmarked for Ukraine. So it's not going. $8 billion is going over there, where a tenth of that would provide, Rice Krispies and make Kellogg's happy for Ethiopians.
Yeah, growth decoupled from commodity, I think. You look at existing socialist projects, and if we wanted to look at growth, look at the growth of literacy rates in Cuba, or the increase of life expectancy. I mean, there's ways of, measuring growth. Right.
The growth of professionals and stuff. Yeah.
Exactly. Right. The rate of a number of doctors to people. I mean, there's numbers of ways of measuring growth that is human flourishing and not commodities. And so I think we need to redefine growth, because I think it is one of those very early things that you begin to grasp even before you read any kind of theory. Infinite growth in a finite universe is fundamentally unsustainable, right? Like, it's a very simple slogan, but it really does grab you. And I remember even being 10, 11, 12 years old, reading basic accounts of the economy. It only grew by 3% this year, or 2% or whatever, and how world ending that was. And I fundamentally couldn't understand why any kind of growth would be bad, why it had to grow by such a continuous rate, why if we couldn't just keep satisfying everyone, that would be enough. And it is just that sort of fundamental equation of how do we measure how a society is serving people. And the way we do it now is by GDP, and that is just fundamentally not capturing true rate of service.
It comes down to exchange value versus use value, I think, that Marx is talking about right away in Capital.
Brilliant, yeah.
And, I mean, it just came to me listening to you guys talk. I'm like, oh, it's, producing things for their useful character rather than for the exchange value that they can bring in a market, which endless growth and exchange value, it doesn't take the planet into account, the ecology into account, those who are starving or in poverty into account, those who are homelessness. It's just growth, like you said, based on the GDP, when there's so many ways to measure human flourishing and human growth, literacy rates being a great example. And think of what the use value of those misiones in Venezuela were that brought, food to people in poverty and taught people how to read. Yeah, it didn't make a lot of money, but think of what it did for the society and for the culture and for those people. And yeah, there was an example in our town. I remember Carlos and I, this was happening when we were working for the Bernie campaign. There were these, it was a public housing, or maybe not public, but really low income housing, like a trailer park. And these luxury housing developers came in, bought all the trailers, bought the whole trailer park out, like doubled or tripled everybody's rent to move them out, and then wiped out the trailer park to build luxury housing. So, destroying something super useful, a bunch of use values in trailers where people with low income were able to live and have shelter, and, replacing it with luxury houses, which may or may not get filled, or may even be a second home for, someone with a bunch of money, because it brings in more exchange value. And I don't know, Carlos, do you remember that presentation I used to do that I made in Dr. Dar's class about there were like 3 or 4 neighborhoods that I took where they basically did public housing, but usually when they do public housing, they cut as many corners as they can and they spend as little money as they can. So it ends up being what we call the projects, a bunch of just gray apartments, that are not well maintained, where people live super close together in sort of crowded conditions. But there were experiments where they created these like ecologically sustainable neighborhoods with a bunch of public parks, not a whole bunch of roads for cars, but a lot of sidewalks and interconnected houses to facilitate communication and interaction between people. And they were incredibly successful. They saved a bunch of money. The people living in them did better, found employment better, had higher rates of happiness than people in the projects, and it hardly cost any money. And it paid itself back, at least if we're talking in terms of use value. But yeah, it's just another example of the kind of housing development that we could have if we were producing things for their useful character.
Right. And I think there's no better way to look at this than look at the metrics that they use, GDP. Under a GDP metric, the consumption of a pack of cigarettes and the consumption of an apple is virtually the same. I don't know how much a pack of cigarettes costs, but take any healthy meal that's equivalent to the cost of a pack of cigarettes, it's the same, right? It's the absolute commensuration of qualitative difference, so that the only way that you can think about difference is quantitatively in terms of numbers. And that's ridiculous, right? Because you have the growth of cancer cells, and then you have the growth of healthy muscle. And a healthy meal produces a healthy form of growth. A pack of cigarettes doesn't, but they're calculated equally under GDP. And China has been developing these new metrics. That's what I was digging for back there. This is my copy of China's Economic Dialectic from Cheng and Fu. He's the director of the Chinese Academy for Social Sciences, and he's developed these different metrics. One of them is GDPW. It's Gross Domestic Product of Welfare. And so it calculates human welfare within growth, similar to how GDP does it, but it's centered on like human welfare. And they've been working to develop these things called happiness index that work at different levels of society, at the small scale family level, at community level, and then at the national macro level. And I think that's something that it's what you get when you begin to apply systematically Marxism and dialectical materialism to all spheres of life. And it's ultimately what I think that these socialist states should be doing. They should have their own metrics for economic growth that are centered on human well-being, and not just abstract growth that considers a pack of cigarettes and an apple virtually the same.
But that's mixing morals up here with what Marx considered a system that operates like in nature. There are natural laws that make the capitalist system operate the way it does, and our wills have nothing to do with it. And that was the first thing we discussed, was that the free will is gone, and we are subject to the laws of capitalism. So it might be nice to provide useful things, for food for starving people and not cigarettes, but if there's more profit in one than the other, what we will and want, we are not going to get under capitalism. We're going to get what is most profitable. The growth should be replaced, for our understanding, with the Marxist concept of accumulation. Capitalism has to accumulate and expand. You know that great Moses and the prophets routine. Accumulate, that's Moses and the prophets. And that's what the capitalist system has to do. And it has to go find markets internationally. So we got globalism. It has to break down. Communist Manifesto has the whole thing. You find a tribe of Indians, well, they're going to be drinking whiskey, and that's the hell, or they're working in the mines, or becoming slaves. They're not good enough slaves. We'll go find slaves somewhere else. Africa, they can stand up better, more stamina. So and it's nothing to do with good people or bad people. Marx says this is not a moral judgment. He has nothing against capitalists as people. He says I don't paint them as rose-colored, but they are just as much a part of the system as the capitalist is following the laws of capitalism the same way the proletarian is. That system won't change. The Chinese have a problem when you say it like this is what the social system should do. They're part of the world economic system. They're subject to the laws of value. And why they're doing nice things that they can do because they don't have a capitalist class that controls their state. They can take that surplus value and redistribute it the way that a capitalist state can't do it, and the way a capitalist state won't do it. But they're still subject to the laws of capitalism, which means their economy has to grow. They have to accumulate and they have to compete on the market. They do that by selling their labor power cheaper than American workers can sell their labor power for. So the American working class actually is in China right now.
But that is correct. Of course, we shouldn't fall into moralizing, and it's so easy to do. And maybe it has a role in terms of mobilizing, right? Daniel de Leon, one of the more prominent Marxist, American Marxists, he had a conception that the struggle for socialism is kind of like a ship. The scientific analysis is the base of the ship, and the sails are the morals. And without the base, you can't move, but without the sails, you can't move, right? Without either, you need both in order to move. But we understand in our tradition something that goes back to Spinoza, which is that freedom is the understanding of necessity, right? So once we understand how these laws operate, we can begin to step foot into the realm of freedom. Not fully, but I think that what China has been able to do is realize that the most important thing, especially in the early stages of socialism, is not necessarily the full expropriation of the capitalists. It's the full expropriation of their political power. And this is something that Lenin understood, that after socialism, really the emphasis becomes politics, right? So the Communist Party controls the state, and that's not to say that their economy isn't largely nationalized, that most of their companies are state-run companies, or that within the private companies that do exist in China, that they don't have influence of Communist Party members within them. Of course they have that, but I understand that they still have to work in a way that's limited by these laws, but they're aware of it because of Marx's analysis and because of the fact that they're led by a Communist Party. And insofar as they're aware of it, they can begin to step into the realm of freedom with such metrics such as that, in terms of analyzing that realm of freedom, but also in terms of, like you mentioned, what's done with the surplus. What's done with the surplus? Well, look at China now. You have tier 8 cities that are much nicer than any of the richest cities in the US. And that's been done in a matter of 20, 30 years since reform and opening up. Although, of course, the Mao era created the Grund for then reform and opening up. But I can't help but see that, yes, they're working within the laws of capitalism, specifically internationally, but in their awareness of it and in their ability and will as a Communist Party at the head of the state, they're able to circumvent certain things and have a foot at least within the realm of freedom.
And I think we can all acknowledge that China themselves are aware that they're subject to the laws of global capital, because Deng Xiaoping and the other people in favor of opening up were aware of that, saying we're going to need to combat corruption and petty bourgeois ideology and all of these things that are going to come along with more markets. So then the question of whether China's socialist comes down to then, can they basically control the invisible hand of the market and the laws of the market that they're subject to with what they call the visible hand, with these poverty alleviation efforts and central planning efforts and, the parts of their economy that are nationalized in public hands. And Carlos, I think, is grabbing Governance of China right now. That's a good book to read about it. And, you could make the argument that the invisible hand, the laws of the market and corruption, is completely overtaken the party or the government. I would push back against that. But I think that's where the question lies. And, a lot of people aren't engaging with that question in an honest way. I guess people who are anti-China says, oh, they're state capitalist and evil, and they're basically just a neoliberal country, which I think we all disagree with. I wanted to go back to something, though, unless anyone had something to say to that, really pressing. But I want to go back to something that Dr. Regan said about how even capitalists are subject to the laws of capitalism. And looking at things like the World Economic Forum's Great Reset, and even looking at ideas like degrowth and seeing the sort of reformulation of these Malthusian ideas, it makes me really worried of what the capitalist ruling class's response to climate change is going to be. Because they know that they need to continue producing more and more surplus value. They're going to continue chasing after whatever maximizes their accumulation and their accumulation of things based on their exchange value. But they're going to recognize that we need to cut down on production or make certain changes in order to prevent horrible weather events and all the other negative effects of climate change. So I don't know. It'd be really interesting to see someone do a really deep dive, like a really close analysis of Malthusianism versus what the World Economic Forum is trying to do with the Great Reset, which I think is sort of like a capitalist response to climate change, as well as an analysis of degrowth, and kind of see how these ideas that I think stem from Robert Thomas Malthus and Malthusianism, or maybe not, consciously, but either way, they're reformulating the same ideas. Be really useful for someone to take a Marxist analysis or a really close look at that. I know Jason Hickel, who I've promoted some of his works before, but he did a book on degrowth. It'd be interesting to study it and its connection to Malthusianism.
About that book by Xi Jinping, the lectures in that book have a theme, and that theme is the party must maintain political control, but we have to lift that control off of the market and let the market be freer. Let the market do what a market's supposed to do. That is really promoting capitalism, because it's a capitalist market. That's what the market is. It's to commodity production. When you get socialism, you don't have commodities are produced for exchange value, not use value. Under socialism, you don't make commodities for exchange value. You make commodities for use value. So as long as they have commodity production in China, they have a capitalist market. And he's saying that we have to lift the control that the state has over that market. Because why is he doing that? Is because he has to compete against a market that has all those freedoms, but crunches up human beings and tosses them on the side. And he can't allow human beings to be crunched up and tossed on the side, but he has to free that market. And so that's a lot of the problems that they are having in China. When you hear and read that they have thousands of demonstrations throughout the country by workers, the migrant workers and the peasants are still doing that, it's because they're squeezing them a little bit. It's what happened with Stalin with the kulaks. He had to squeeze the kulaks because he had to feed the workers. Workers don't produce food, the kulaks do. So
it's important to remember though that first volume are writings from 2014 when she had just gotten into office.
Over, I know. Yeah, I haven't got to the. If you got to the second one, I hope it'll be happier.
It's by volume 4 now, so it's changed, and there's been a constant transformation They just recently implemented their new. They work like their plans are always structured around nice slogans, and they just recently shifted towards common prosperity and the active influence of the Communist Party on the market is a lot stronger. But even there, you still have that notion of the visible hand coming in to rein in the invisible hand, which is coupled with that promotion of liberalization of the market. But um, that kind of dies off. That has kind of died off in the recent years, in the last decade or so. And I think you see that in the other volumes of the collection.
Yes, because they're being very successful in their competition because of the road initiative.
Yeah.
That's helping them out, and I'm all for a chicken in every pot. That's a good slogan.
And to bolster your point, Carlos, about there being multiple volumes since, I'm searching this Vijay Prashad article right now. I can't find it, but since volume 1 is when NATO had that summit and they announced that China and Russia are like their number one enemies going forward. That was in like 2016 or 2017. So that's one of the main geopolitical shifts I think that we've seen since he wrote that volume, which probably changed things for China a little bit too. And it's been a while since I've read that book, but I also remember parts of that book where she is kind of talking about liberating the state and the party from the market and the effects of the market. Mainly with the anti-corruption efforts, saying we knew this was going to happen. We knew we were going to have to battle capitalist corruption. There basically needs to be a purge in the party, and we need people who are dedicated, principled, blah, blah, blah. Which is, kind of what Xi Jinping has become famous for in China now is being the big boss and cracking down on corruption. So I think that's one way where they've tried to sort of separate the state and the party from the market in a way. But definitely an interesting conversation.
Yeah, we should get back to the Marx.
It always is going to go to China at some point.
We've gone off. We've defected to the Chinese.
All roads lead to China today.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's absolutely right. And I read in Roland Bohr's Socialism with Chinese Characteristics that it got so bad, not just in the wild 90s, but in the early 2000s, right before Xi Jinping, that you can talk to any Communist Party member and ask them just basic questions about Marxism, Leninism, and they wouldn't fucking know anything, right? That's how rampant corruption was. And there was a lot of people that were in the party, but they couldn't be any farther from being communists. And that all really changed with Xi Jinping coming back into power. He's been the restrictions have been lifted, have been raised in order to join the party. It's like a 2-year process to join. You have to be active in your community, working with people, and also you have these theoretical exams that force you to be well read in Marxism and to understand the basis of Marxism, Leninism. And that's coupled with a promotion of scholarship and the application of Marxism to basically every sphere of life. That's one of the things that you really get emphasized in that text that I'm reading from Cheng and Fu, which is how important it is for them to develop Marxism comprehensively, to take it with them everywhere, because they realize that the dialectical materialist analysis is the best analysis for comprehending reality, and that it doesn't matter what field you're in. Odds are that if you take an analysis that's integral, that's comprehensive, that looks at things in their interconnections, in their dynamism, in their movement, you're going to have a better shot at getting truth and at making things work than if you're not doing that. So he's been promoting journals. There's a bunch of journals, even in English, that have arisen, a bunch of new institutes and schools of Marxism, some of them which are specialized to specific fields, to Sinified Marxism, to the study of imperialism, to the study of political economy, of philosophy, of different fields. So there's been a lot of changes since Xi Jinping got into power in China.
That's a little red book. That was the function of the little red book. You carried that around and applied it to everything. The toothaches, going to the dentist. Oh, wow, I had something to say about that.
Driving the bus. A revisionist goes too far left or too far right.
I still have my little red book.
The true communist goes straight. I have the red book too. I love the little red book. It's a good one. Sorry, one last thing about China. I just want to say, like, in the 90s, Parenti was talking about how they were moving towards neoliberalism. That was when he made that assessment, which a lot of people use to be anti-China. You know, they'll say, oh, even Tanky Parenti was against it. But again, talking about a different time period, and I think that shows how class struggle continues even under socialism, which has been one of the main insights gleaned by Chinese Marxist academics. You know, at times it's looked like the market and the bourgeoisie has had more control, and you know, since then, as a reaction to that, there's been more struggle the other way. So it's, as Vijay Prashad says, it's like a constant calibration and recalibration and a re-strategizing and repositioning themselves based on what's going on with their own economy internally, as well as what's going on externally with the imperialists.
Well, this year, if you've been reading the paper, there's been a big crackdown on the capitalists. They squeezing the capitalists. They're really complaining.
Yeah.
Some
Poor
of them
guys.
are going to jail.
In 2014, they executed a bunch. I know that's a ways back, but
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the beauty.
Over here.
That's the beauty of Marxist thought, is that it's not orthodoxy. It adapts and it changes. And so based on material conditions, it is not always the same, right? It's always developing. And I think that's a great point, that it's not like you achieve socialism and then that's it, right? Like the development continues, thought continues and adjusts, especially living in a world that's still economically dominated by capitalism.
That was Gorbachev.
Yeah.
He overcompensated for defects. He and the Queen are both gone now, so it's a different world.
Right. Gorbachev and the Queen, like a week from one another?
Okay. We just need Kissinger. I just need Henry Kissinger to die. He's
first
on my cancer list.
Kissinger is. You can say what you like about Kissinger. When you read him, he is a cold rationalist about how to maintain American power, and you know exactly what the ruling class is up to when you read that guy. Mm-hmm. And when he's criticizing the way the United States is carrying on towards Russia now.
I know, isn't that wild? When Kissinger,
he sees it's a losing proposition.
Yeah.
Our newspapers make it look like Putin's on his last legs, and we just got an international poll that said he's got 81% support now in the country.
Right. When Kissinger is to the left of a lot of the so-called progressive Democrats, at least with this issue of imperialism, who have been voting for war creds left and right, that's a world that kind of makes you think a little bit. But Kala, you were going to say something.
Oh, I was saying exactly what you said. Just when Kissinger says you're going too far, I think that is a clear sign. But yes.
I think we should, the Communist Party should reach out to Henry Kissinger. Try and make it all
What a get. What a great
he
get.
He will be in our coalition if he's against Trump.
What a popular friend.
The Vanguard. Henry Kissinger, the Vanguard. That's right.
You're going to carry posters of Henry Kissinger in the street next to a hammer trickle.
Oh, God.
I think there's one more point from the short preface that is important. And it's somewhat of an optimistic point. And I think that it'd be good to marinate on it, especially considering that it's been approximately 100 and some change years since the first successful socialist revolution took place. But he says here, let's see where it is. Mankind thus inevitably sets itself only such tasks as it is able to solve, since closer examination will always show that the problem itself arises only when the material conditions for its solution are already present, or at least in the course of formation. I think this is very important, and it goes back to the idea that thinking is conditioned. So if we can have the ideas of socialism and a world beyond capitalism, it means that the material conditions have been created for those ideas to arise. And I think that in a moment of comprehensive crisis like the one that we're facing now, which, we have a multipolar world that's arising, that, it's challenging American unipolar imperialism. You have a crisis at home, economic, political crisis. You have mental health crisis. It's just literally crisis in every sphere of life. I don't know if the conditions could be any riper for getting to the masses and preaching the good word of of socialism. So, what do you guys think? What do you think of the quote?
There, it's a true quote, but it's expanded from the situation in Germany to now that capitalism has got the whole world. They can give enough goodies to people in this country that they are not living like people in Africa or in areas of Haiti and places like that, that they can get by, and they will not fight to the death to get rid of that system unless they have to do it to survive. And the majority don't have to do that. So what they're turning to for relief is, many people understand their suffering. Many people understand that they have to change the system, but they have no idea how to do it. And they think maybe Trump can do it because he's anti-establishment and he's different from all, he certainly is. He's different from all the other type of Republicans we've had. And he's different from, he even quotes, I love his Mussolini quote when he was called, if you remember, he was attacked for quoting Mussolini. They said, "You like Mussolini?" And he said, "I like good quotes."
He just quoted Lenin too recently, a couple of days ago.
Wait, I missed that. What did he say?
A man for all seasons.
I forget what he said. It was not like a favorable quote, but he did quote Lenin.
I mean, I'll take it. It's great.
Treaties are like pie crusts made to be broken.
I think that there is some truth to that until rebellion becomes more comfortable than the comfort in the present uncomfort, you won't rebel. And that's kind of a tongue twister, but I think there's some truth to that. But I do think that considering what the living standard that people in the U.S. have come to expect and the one that they're getting now, there's a contradiction there between expectation and reality. And the weight of inflation, the weight of stagnated wages, the weight of, illnesses that cannot be covered because a lot of people are not insured or underinsured, the weight of debt for trying to buy a home, the weight of debt for trying to get an education, all of those factors are over determining the current condition in the masses, and I think are getting them to that point where the space between the expectation and the reality is so far off that even though they don't have the conditions that like people in the third world do that are being super exploited by imperialism, there's so much of a gap that I think the same effect could take place if you have that active, that formative yeast, which is what the Cadre, a Vanguard Party, is supposed to function like. It's the yeast that under the right conditions is able to elevate the mass of people towards socialism. I think we have the dough ready. We have everything set. What we're really missing is the yeast. And I think
what's the yeast? What's the yeast?
The Cadre Party that successfully gets to the masses. We have a whole lot of people. We have a whole lot of people that call themselves communists, but that scratch off half the country and call half of the working class fascist because conditions of crisis have led them to go towards a buffoon like Trump. Those are people we should be reaching. Those are people that Eddie and I, in our active work in Dubuque, we're reaching and we're bringing towards socialism. and there wasn't a party to continue the movement with them, but we brought them to Bernie, which was the best we could do at the moment. But if there's a strong party that I think does its work and gets to the masses and doesn't scratch off part of the working class based on some of their views or who they voted for in 2016 or 20, you can create the conditions for that revolutionary movement. It's right now, the leaders cannot ruin the old way, and people cannot stand being ruled in the old way. Something is about to pop. It's the time of monsters.
That's getting a little optimistic. The problems are not anything like the problems of the Great Depression.
No, they're worse.
Not worse than the Great Depression.
Only 11%
the Great Depression was complete, almost total unemployment for working people. Factories closed down. The unemployment rate in the United States, fake as it is nothing compared to what it was in the Great Depression. And that Great Depression rose the consciousness of the people in and of itself and made the Communist Party a major, and the Socialist Party attractive to them. But right now, the people, as long as the people are content to vote for Biden for their solutions, and that's what the Democratic Party is there. There's no third party. Any third party that pops up and appeals, those working people, those masses of people are not going for it. They're sticking with it because it's not as bad as it was in the Great Depression. The steel workers are not out of work. The automobile workers maybe want more money, but they're not out of work. They're not selling pencils and apples on the, and we all know what got them out of the Depression was the war. That's what got them out of the Depression. Massive government spending for the military. That's why we're giving $8 billion to the Ukraine, is we have a huge hundreds of thousands of people working for the Pentagon and working in military industries for Boeing. They're getting all that money, and that's keeping the working class docile when it comes to breaking with the two-party system. They've got an eco party out there. They've got the Green Party. The Green Parties in Europe are in power in governments, coalition governments, where they were in Germany. Our Green Party, it can't, not even in Congress.
There is some truth to that, of course, but you look at other statistics and they're worse. I mean, we have in William Z. Foster's text towards Soviet America, it's around the same time of the Great Depression, and it's looking at the statistics. And I had a chance recently to compare the statistics with the ones that we have today, and it's not that far off. Some things it was worse before, other things it's worse now. I don't think you've ever had in American history a condition where, as we have today, only 11% of the population trusts the media. Only 17% of the population trust the two-party system. You have the conditions where people are already at the level of their consciousness realizing that the existing order is insufficient. You have an extremely low favorability rate for the last two presidents. I think the conditions are ripe in some areas, more ripe than they were during the era of the Great Depression. In others, not as much. But I still think that active element, that yeast, that Vanguard Party that reaches the masses and that, doesn't discriminate based on who's more enlightened in the working class, but reaches workers because objectively, because of their position in the economy, they're revolutionary. That's the factor that I think is missing the most. And it's very easy to point at the working class and say, oh, you're bad, you're not enlightened enough, and call them a basket of deplorables. It's harder to see how it is that you had the function as a communist to take these moments of crisis and to run with them and to organize working people and educate them, and you didn't do it. And that those working people literally voted for a maniac billionaire before getting organized by communists.
They didn't actually vote for him, the working class. He got in by a fluke. He got in by 55,000 votes in 2 or 3 different counties and swing states that swung those states.
In swing states in the industrial Midwest.
Yeah, but they were only 55,000 votes out of all the millions. No. they were middle class votes, most of those votes, not working class votes. Some of the working class people stayed home. Black people stayed home. The fact is they stayed home, most of them. If the black people had come out and voted for Clinton the way they voted for Obama would not, they would have carried those swing states. But they didn't do it. So they're the most exploited. But they didn't, we're not appealing to them. It's not that we can't go out and talk to them, but the union movement in this country, we don't have a left-wing union movement. All the countries that have socialists, have social democrats, which are at least better than anything we've got over here, have labor unions and parties that are identified with the workers. The Democratic Party, as you know, broke its relations with the AFL-CIO under Clinton and went for the yuppies and the city people, and the unions have no leadership.
And I mean, we've recognized that and talked about that on our show, especially with our comrade Cruzy, who's in the unions right now, trying to organize some of the industrial unions, and he talks up. Oh, sorry, my stomach is cramping. I did abs today. He's talked to us a lot about how the labor movement has been weakened, and the need to go into those blue collar unions and strengthen them. I want to rewind though, because I do get the comment about the Great Depression, where unemployment was higher, which is traditionally how you measure capitalism failing. And as you mentioned, now the unemployment rate is fake. And there's various ways of hiding what true unemployment is. But I mean, if we're just going to go off of quantitative factors, there are tons of factors today that are worse. Opioid addiction, depression, suicide, all these crises. Because as Carlos said, and I don't think revolution necessarily stems from, oppression of people reaches a certain level and then everybody rises up. It's, as Carlos said, when people don't see a future, when their expectation of what life should be and their standard of living isn't matched by the society they're in. And that's the crisis that all young people are looking at today. They're not thinking they're going to be able to have kids. They're scared of the climate crisis. There's really an identity crisis among young people. And in young men, it's causing them to turn towards these figures like Andrew Tate, who are these online figures preaching masculinity. And, even though the system sucks, you just got to be such an alpha male, such an ubermensch, that you can just destroy the system. And a lot of kids fall into that. But the reason they're falling into it is because they don't see a future for themselves, because they don't have any sense of identity. And those are the people that I think, at least when you're talking about young people, who you can reach to and really pitch a message of change. And you're right that every party in the West has been co-opted. I mean, the Green Party is a fair example. They're not a Marxist party at all, so I would expect them to be co-opted. But that's part of the problem is combating opportunism and combating corruption. But what we need is a true party actually based in the working class, and I would say also based in the labor movements. Like you said, if you look at Evo Morales in Bolivia is from the trade unions. Nicolas Maduro, I believe, was from the unions. So you have these sort of you have political leaders and union leaders who grow out of the class struggle, who grow out of the struggle. And I think that's where we need to place our focus in the U.S. with a combination of political struggle, party struggle, community organizing, and workplace organizing and union organizing.
Okay, you're right. But what is a crisis for Marxists? A crisis isn't dope, people taking dope, or unemployment, or people starving in the streets. A crisis for capitalism, and the only crisis that takes down capitalism is a crisis of overproduction and rate of profit falling, and the capitalists can't get rid of their commodities, they can't reinvest, and their system breaks down. When they're unemployed, when the capitalists can't put gasoline in their cars and put chickens in their pots, that's the crisis. As long as the capitalists are having their profits, as long as the stock market chugs along with its ups and downs, there's no crisis. The people, that's it. The people are not, they're just going to suffer. When the stock market collapses, that's what perpetrates the crisis. And it was the collapse of the stock market as a result of a crisis of overproduction. And boom, they couldn't get rid of their commodities that caused the Great Depression. And unless the stock market crashes, we're not going to be able to get the working class to listen to us.
In
They got football, they don't need us.
I'm curious because I mean, obviously in 2008 we had a crisis of overproduction. We've seen them in cycles, so there's obviously another one destined in the future. We know crises of overproduction are inherent to capitalism, but I am curious, and maybe and I don't. Where is it that Marx says that revolution and organization of the proletariat can only come about during a crisis of overproduction?
He doesn't say that can only come about in a crisis. He points out that these are the crises that capitalism has, are these crises of overproduction. What the crisis, the final conflict. I hate it. You're international. Doesn't even mention the working class. It's the ideal of brothers and sisters who all love each other, and that'll make a better world.
It's a Prudhonian international.
It's not a Marxist internationalism in that song. What happens for the final conflict, why the capitalist system breaks down, is when the productive system is held back. That is the ability to produce the things that people need. The system, because of the relations of production, can't do that. And that causes a crisis in the system. They're not producing the commodities that people need. The system is holding them back. It collapses, and then the workers take over the factories and run the factories themselves to produce the articles of need for everybody, and the capitalists are sidelined. That's the blueprint for it. And that's an economic crisis that results because of the contradiction between the relations of production and what we're capable of, what production can do with different relations. And people can be alienated and commit suicide and OD all they like. Unless that happens, capitalism is going to just be there.
I'm not sure. I think that
I disagree with that.
I think that one of
and
the
I don't think that's in Marx.
It is in Marx and
I mean no the crises of overproduction are, I don't see the point though where Marx says that this is the only place where workers will listen to a Vanguard Party. I think that's a little
the point
is
they're opened up to it.
The Vanguard Party.
I don't think he says that either though. And we've been experiencing crises of overproduction since the Great Depression. Yeah, a lot of them haven't been bad. There have been stabilizers and crutches placed on to capitalism to try and stabilize it. But then our strategy should evolve. I don't think we should just rely on this moment of a crisis of overproduction as the only time when we can go out and organize and hope for revolution. Sorry, Carlos.
Especially because that replicates the same positions of the school of economism, which Leninism criticizes so much, which is let's just wait for the crisis and then we'll get shit started. No, the point is you have to start organizing even when times are good. Are the workers going to be more receptive when those crises of overproduction hits? Yes, but you have to set yourself the ground so that when those crises hit, the conditions are set so that you can use that dissenting attitude that's created.
That is correct. You are correct. But it's not economism. Economism is that you don't engage. You do everything that you want to do. You organize a Vanguard Party. You do all the organizing, but you just don't pay any attention to politics. The whole fight is just going to be between you and the capitalists of the factories. That's economism. No, we're not going to vote. That's economism. But
Well, that's an
Lenin-
So we
aspect.
need to wage the ideological struggle and the political struggle, even at times when capitalism
Yes,
isn't
that's
in
what
a
Lenin-
direct crisis.
That's why you have a cadre party. Lenin wants a cadre party because there won't be because it's got to be there for that day that comes when the capitalist system finally cannot solve its problems and breaks down. And nobody will know the proper thing to do unless there's been a cadre party around predicting this, teaching this, so the working class will be expecting this. That's what we're supposed to do. But we don't have a cadre party that does it. So if we don't have a cadre party that does it, it won't get done. And that means it doesn't matter how much suffering what happens. The solution that will come will be Mussolini and Hitler instead of Lenin or Mao.
I think we agree on that, and I think the only disagreement that I don't think it was a disagreement, but it was how do we analyze crisis? Because I think we're both understanding crisis in a more expansive way, as you know, at the human level. It's not in line with the traditional orthodox notion of crisis as crisis of overproduction. We know that those are coming, but you have to. Crisis is a word that's not just tied to political economy. It's tied to all these other things that are connected to political economy, and you literally use it in mainstream discourse. There's a crisis of mental health care. There's a crisis of homelessness. It's literally used in all these spaces. And so when we're talking about these series of comprehensive crises, it might not be that the main one yet has arrived, which is that crisis of overproduction, which is going to come. We're for sure that it's bound to be here soon. But there's these other crises that I think overdetermine the conditions so that when that big crisis comes, it's even more fertile. And that's the weakest. That's one of the things that Lenin brings to the table, in my view, and in the theory of the struggle for socialism, is an analysis of how these beyond crisis of overproduction factors help you in the struggle towards socialism. And that's something that I think we have to bring within our analysis today. You have all these other ills around society that are also opening up people to the idea of an alternative order that are not directly related to crisis of overproduction, but which at the material level have the same effect on people. You have people that, yeah, sure, a lot of them may not be unemployed like they were during the Great Depression, but they can't afford their subsistence because of inflation and because of stagnated wages. And I think those are conditions that they might not be the ripest in terms of thinking about crisis as just overproduction, but they're pretty ripe condition for reaching people. But I do agree, there is no magic party.
We're not arguing about that.
And-
You can reach them, you can organize them, you can have a little, the poor you shall always have with you societies out there. Let's feed the poor and stuff. But they're not going to be revolutionary. They're not going to be able to pull off a revolution. They tried in France in '68 and it didn't work.
I agree. When you lay out like what is to be done, we need to form this cadre party which predicts the crisis of overproduction, and then at a time of actual crisis and economic collapse, that's when you have a revolutionary period. I think after hearing you explain that, my main contention was you said at one point workers aren't going to listen to us till the crisis. What I'm against is just ignoring workers until the crisis comes and then being like, oh, follow us, because by then it's too late. Right. Yeah. Once you explained it, it made more sense.
They will. Some of them will listen to us. The ones that aren't wearing the MAGA hats.
I don't know.
To us. Maybe you can get a MAGA hat.
Some of them might. I've got a few.
The MAGA people in the Midwest, at least, the ones that were working class, they were Obama, and then Trump. So that should tell you something. That was almost like a protest vote. And a lot of them realized that they voted for an idiot very soon. He promised all these jobs. None of them came. We knew they weren't going to come. But I think a lot of those people.
Obama. Same thing under. They got the same thing under Trump.
Right, and a lot of those people, I think, would be open to our message.
Yes, listen, that's why we're here, right? to try to lay the foundation for that party.
I thought we were here for
Our
CV
Cadre
padding.
school.
Isn't CV padding what we do?
What's CV padding? Oh,
Padding the CV, the
I don't
curriculum.
have to pad my CV anymore. You have to pad your CV. And once you've got it padded, you'll be wearing a suit and saying, "I can't believe I was talking about mental health."
For now, it's Guayaberas. When you see me with a suit, that's when you start raising suspicions. But any last comments either about the text or about the other conversations that we've been having? They're all connected to the text, so they haven't been like tangents that take off too wild into the forest. But
I would just like to say, like, Dr. Riggins has been a militant Marxist forever, so he's used to inner Marxist debates. But there's so many people on the left who can't engage in a debate or a disagreement or even play devil's advocate and learn from it. It's just complete dismissal of the person as soon as they say something you don't disagree with. But like, I feel like, think how much we learned by disagreeing with each other or even just playing devil's advocate, because we all have the same goal of socialism. So, you can learn by bouncing ideas, and it may seem silly or childish to point that out, but like, it's just so common to see on Twitter or online where you have conversations between Marxists where they're calling each other idiots and, the worst things imaginable when they agree on 99% of stuff. So it's like, debate is, a super useful tool for intellectuals. It has been forever. So,
well, the origin of the word dialectic was tied to debate, right? To the ability through debate and through back and forth to elevate yourself to truth and to reason. And yeah, if you don't have the experience online of like people calling you racist, like done to us for just basic things, or calling you idiots, or read this, and then they send the book that you've read like 3 times, or it's so stupid, the culture that's online. And it's really refreshing to be able to have these discussions where there's, I think, seemingly, I don't think there were any real tense points of contention, but these contentions that could be debated, and I think help us all learn and overcome whatever insufficiencies were on any side of the point. And that is dialectics, right? That sort of elevated both of the sort of statements that we were making towards. We were forced to say, for instance, to specify what sort of crisis we were talking about. That was a process of concretizing the understanding of crisis. And that's ultimately, I think, the sort of space that we should be trying to create, that encourages this comradely debate and this genuine approach at getting at the truth, because we see truth tied to the process of freeing the working masses and of organizing for socialism. And it's completely antithetical to all the shit that goes on online, where people just block other people when they disagree with them and pass judgment abstractly, just based on the surface level, how things look. Okay, I'll take it for what it is, instead of analyzing really what's behind this, what's actually being said when this person says this.
And these questions aren't black and white. Like, everyone acts like, there's, the right opinion, and then everyone who disagrees is just a complete idiot and a moron not worth talking to. Like, there's a lot of really complex questions to ask and debates to be had about the Chinese system, and what they call socialism with Chinese characteristics. So it's like, if you're not open to debate and disagreement, you're not going to be able to learn about the China at all, their system at all, because there's a lot of complex questions to be debated.
Get rid of the purity fetish you have. It's not just about feeling morally better than other people. It's a boring thing to be motivated by.
Right. And with respect to the China question, if you're, I don't know if loyal is the right word, but if you're supportive of China but against debating the things that are going on in China, you're not really supportive, because they're constantly debating. But you have to debate it from a comradely standpoint, not say because they don't have these pure structures of what socialism looks like in the Critique of the Gotha program, we should condemn them and then, the U.S. encircle them and overthrow their revolution.
The Chinese are the only hope we have of keeping and revitalizing a world Marxist movement. It's their mixed economy controlled with a socialist goal that is moving into Africa and displacing. The United States is worried about them because the Africans are saying they treat us, they're just not out to take and poison our waters and stuff. They treat us like humans.
Right.
And the people in Latin America are feeling that way too. That's a system that can bring about the quickening of the collapse of this decadent capitalist system we have. So I see the Chinese. That's because I was brought up to think that's what the Soviets were going to do. Okay, well, they failed, and Cuba's too small. Who's going to? China, good. Thank goodness they're there. So they're the next hope, and they'll help Cuba get along too. I bet. Too. Where the struggle is, Marx says, the class struggle takes place at the point of production, where the working class meets the factory machines and stuff. It doesn't take place on TikTok and Twitter. That's not what's going to rise up. Yeah, the Twitter people are attacking the White House. That's not going to happen. So if we could take this work, we work the 2 pages. It is, by the way, also the PhD in philosophy. That's really a pretty elitist reading when you read that. You have good education when you read that. A lot of workers wouldn't understand what he's talking about. If you could translate that into worker-ese in a respectful way, not like, dumb and these stupid words and stuff, but so that they could get the main ideas and somehow print up leaflets like that to hand out to working people, Starbucks workers and Amazon workers and people on strike. That would be a way to really, I think, help bring up the consciousness of the working class. But there has to be a Vanguard Party that's willing to do that. And they're either too small or they have given up on organizing the working class per se and think that they can flip the Democratic Party, which isn't going to happen. So there's no vehicle out there to do it. So if the workers aren't ready, the capitalists will supply them with demagogues to come in. And that's the success of Trump. If we had a successful communist Marxist movement and labor movement in this country, Trump wouldn't have gotten anywhere. But these are workers, not necessarily union workers. These are only 11% or less are in unions. These are ununionized workers. There's nobody to raise their class consciousness. And so they fall for somebody like Trump. He's tough. He's that man, the masculine guy. He'll do it, all the blah, 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 blah. And if some Marxists don't get together and try to form a real working class oriented party that isn't just tailism, running after Democrats and liberals, there could very well be a fascist takeover in this country. There's nothing to say that could never happen.
I agree. I'd love to ask more questions about how to build that vehicle or that party, but maybe we'll save that for another time.
That's next week.
I don't want to get myself in trouble.
Right. Oh, and for everyone listening, maybe not the people that are live now because we're about to go, but if you watch the recording, or if you want, after watching it live, to go check out the recording and recommend short texts that you want us to cover, kind of like the one we did today. We've done something similar in the past, you and I, Kala, where we sat down and we discussed Che's Socialism and Man in Cuba. But if you want to recommend stuff that you consider to be important to learning Marxist theory and that might be difficult to digest for everyday folks, and you want us to sit down here and discuss it, please do that in the comments to our YouTube video. And we hope to bring these programs to you at least a couple times a month. I think it's so important. One of my favorite shows in Spanish does this. It's Escuela de Cuadro. And although they're trots, they have some trots leanings, but just being able to sit down and have a discussion about text. I think it's so important, and it's so helpful for both the people involved and for the audience. So if you have any recommendations, please let us know. And with that, we would like to thank you all for watching our first episode of Cadre Formation School here at Midwestern Marx. And we'd like to wish you all a good rest of your day.
Solidarity, everyone.